Okay, hello everybody. So before I go into the next part of experimental research, I want to give you a couple, some notes or like subtopic that I need you guys to make sure that you know this. So some of the elements of research, just of every single research that's out there, from descriptive to correlation to experiment, that these things all need to be in those studies, okay? So first of all, let's start with, so what I want you to do is I would like for you guys to, let me see if I could underline here, is I want you to write this at the top of your notes, right? So it'll be elements of research, okay? And then each one of these that I'm gonna cover are going to be a subtopic, okay? So just to make sure that you guys have everything that you need for this information, okay, in your notes. Okay, and the first thing that really after everything that we're done with research, kind of the last thing that happens is your theory. Okay, and basically a theory is an explanation of an explanation based on this evidence, right? That can predict behaviors or events, right? So you guys could copy that straight from there because it's pretty simplified, right? Which is basically after I've done this research and I have evidence, then we can use this theory and basically be able to predict other people's behaviors or ourselves or even events, okay? Now, obviously, I can't just come up with any theory. So in order for it to work, it's going to have to make sure that I have the facts and I have evidence based on my research. Okay, the next little subtopic of an element that needs to be in research or part of research is basically this idea of hypothesis that we have covered. So just write it again as a subtopic, hypothesis. And hypothesis is what we've spoken about, which is basically, okay, so hypothesis is basically this idea of it's a testable, right? We're going to be able to test it, description of an expected outcome of a study. So we have mentioned it's for this class to write a hypothesis. It's the if and then, and you guys will see when we go into experimental how useful this will be in that type of study. Okay. The next one is one of the main goals for research, and we need to ensure with our research is that it can be replicated and generalized as well. So what does that mean? So you're going to want to put replication, okay, as your subtopic. And it's basically that with all this information that you gave us, specifically the operational definition of the variables, right? So write that down. So in order for it to be replicated, we need to make sure that our operational definition of the variables and the actual step by steps are very, very clear and detailed. Okay, so this allows for replication. Okay, so make sure that you know that if we have our step by steps super detailed and our operational definition of the variables, like how are we going to observe it and how are we going to measure it, this allows for other people out there in the research world to pick up our study and basically replicate it, okay? But more importantly as well of the replication, when we replicate it, and jot this down, okay, it's not here on the slide, so don't look at the slide. If we're gonna replicate it, we wanna make sure that our results are also the same. Okay, so when we're replicating, then if the results are the same, then they would say that your research is valid, right? It's testing what it's supposed to test, okay? And then we're gonna go to generalization. Like we wanna be able to, and you may wanna put this under replication. So generalization is basically that we can apply this information with a big group of people, right, in our population. Now, like case studies, for instance, case studies, we can't necessarily generalize to everybody because it's really, really specific in the people and the characteristics that they're studying, right? But there are some valid things like the Phineas Gage one of the frontal lobe, we all know that the frontal lobe, the different functions because of one of those case studies, besides many others, but it was kind of like the opening of that. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about, and this is definitely super important, this next little section, which is kind of population, random sampling. We're going to talk about representative sampling and then random selection. Okay, but let's start with the first subtopic of the population. What does that mean in research? Okay, so put as your next subtopic, right, under elements of research, you're going to put population. Okay, and then under that, you'll start with your bullets, right? So population is basically anybody in the population that can be part of the study. Okay, so it's basically how many people, it's who I want to study. So for instance, the population could be literally everybody in the United States. It could also be all the females in the world or all the females in Miami, or, it could be very, very specific or super, super big that it's like the entire population of the world. It just depends on what you're studying. So if I'm doing a study on high school students, right, the effects of giving them candies to increase participation, then my population for that study would be all high school students. And do I want also high school students in the world or United States, right? But if I'm going to use the population of high school, it's literally all high school students in the world. Now, that is not ideal, obviously. So what they need to do is get a sample, okay? And a sample is basically the people that you want represented from your population. Okay, so this sample is going to be like obviously smaller. So I can't get the billions of people that live in the United States or the world, right, from let's say high schoolers, but I can get a smaller amount, right? So that would be my sample. However, and write this down for sample, the sample must have representation of everybody in the population. So I wouldn't have to have a good representation sample of Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans, natives, things like that would all have to be either female, male. All of that will also have to be representative in my sample. Okay, so now the next little subtopic is what's called random sample. Now, random sample, okay, is basically every person in the population, right, that has an equal chance of being part of this sample, okay? I just need to make sure that the sample that I receive is representative of the population, okay? Now, there is also something called, okay, when I was talking about sample, it also could be called representative sample, which is basically the sample that you're going to use that has the same characteristics from that are similar to the population. So like I was saying with if there's a certain amount of Hispanics, African Americans, whites, natives, males, females, that would have to be in your representative sample, okay? Or just your sample. Sometimes they just say sample. This is the people I'm gonna pluck from the population. Now, how do I pluck that is your next subtopic, which is random sample, okay? And then random sample is that they're literally, they all have an equal opportunity, like your representative sample has an equal opportunity to be part of your sample, right? So they're gonna randomly choose those people, okay? Now, we also have next to the subtopic, which is also should be a review, is operational definition. And this is when, especially what you guys will need to be doing is creating an operational definition for variables. So specifically either the independent variable or dependent. And don't worry, we will cover that. Okay, so operational definition is just how we're going to observe and measure our variables so that we can replicate and get the same results. So when they replicate, they could get the same results, and then we can create a theory from that, okay? Then we have what's called random selection. Now, random selection goes a little bit more into the experimental research. So I will actually just put that on pause for now and get back to it when we get into experimental, okay? But this is basically it for this little section of the elements of research. And now the next video will be about the experiment research.